Amid the stifling streets of Jericho, where gold flowed more freely than compassion, lived a man who seemed to have everything, and yet was empty inside, surrounded by wealth, but hated by his own people, guarded by soldiers, yet far from any peace. They called him a traitor, a servant of Rome, a corrupt man, untouchable, unreachable. But no one knew what lay behind the precise accounting and the locked gates, a shattered heart trapped in its own invisible prison. His name Zacchaeus. Many see him only as the one who climbed the tree. But what if the tree was merely the first step of a rise that would change everything? What no one mentions is that Zacchaeus didn't just see Jesus. He was seen by him. And in that moment, something happened. Something that neither money, nor status, nor the Roman system could control. Something that would transform the most unlikely of men into a living symbol of redemption. Who was Zacchaeus before the encounter that changed his story? Why did Jesus call him by name in the midst of a crowd that despised him? And what happened to him after he came down from the tree? The Bible says little, but the ancient records and the echoes of the early communities tell much more. Before we dive into this moving journey, click subscribe and turn on notifications. That way you won't miss any of these forgotten and deeply revealing stories. Now then, get ready to uncover the hidden truth behind the remarkable story of Zacchaeus. Do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. John 7:24. The streets of Jericho awoke with a bittersweet scent of spices and sweat. Camels groaned under the weight of their loads. Children ran barefoot over the market. Stones and merchants shouted with a hunger for profit. Above them all, on a noble angled balcony, stood a man of short stature but sharp presence, eyes dark as molten bronze and a robe of imported linen. No one ignored him, but almost everyone pretended he didn't exist. The crowd averted their eyes, not out of respect, but out of disdain. To the Jews, he was a traitor. To the Romans, a useful dog. To himself, he was a survivor. Zacchaeus came from Levite blood, born under the sound of the Torah, recited in sacred voice. His father had been a scribe, an honest man crushed by the hands of a decaying and oppressive system. Zacchaeus had watched him break under the weight of debts, deprivation, and the abandonment of his own people. And from that trauma, a deviation was sown. He would no longer serve a temple that had cast his father out no more. He learned to deal with numbers, promises, and threats. He rose quickly. The empire needed men hungry for power, and he had an appetite strong enough to swallow reputations. As chief tax collector, Zacchaeus set rates, gave orders, organized seizures. If someone delayed, they lost their home. If they resisted, they lost blood. The people saw him as a social leper, an excommunicated man with a perfumed appearance. Still, Zacchaeus was alone. He lived among marble walls and silence. His banquets were filled with bought laughter, his nights full of restlessness. The gold beneath his feet didn't warm the growing void inside him. In the water mirror where he washed his hands, he didn't see a man, but an abyss with eyes. That morning, a different murmur echoed across the rooftops. Servants came and went in haste with the same news. "He's coming, who?" Zacchaeus asked indifferently, not yet looking up from the tax records. "The Nazarene, Jesus, the one who works miracles." The name dropped like a stone into deep waters. Jesus. He had heard that name before, in caravan whispers, in beggars' murmurs, and in the hope-filled faces of those once crushed by guilt. They said he touched the unclean, that he spoke with authority but without a sword, that he offered forgiveness where the priests offered only condemnation. Zacchaeus closed his eyes. A strange discomfort rose in his chest, a longing he didn't recognize or perhaps had buried long ago. He wanted to see this man. He hurried down the stone stairs. The crowd was already gathering around the walls. Men, women, children, all pressed together as if waiting for a king. Zacchaeus tried to push through, but arms shoved him back. Murmurs rose like spears. "Get out, thief. This path isn't yours." Cursed tax collector. He tried to push on, but his stature betrayed him. He was too small to rise above the crowd's shoulders, and too hated for anyone to make room. Breathless sweat soaking his fine robe, his eyes scanned the surroundings there. Just a few steps ahead, a tall sycamore stretched its branches like open arms. A boy pointed and shouted, "Climb up, go on, shorty." Without thinking, Zacchaeus ran. He grabbed the trunk, climbing through jeers and ridicule, his dignity snagged on every torn bark. But up there, above all judgment he could see, the road dust lifted as the procession advanced. Jesus was coming, and he was nothing like the prim rabbi Zacchaeus had known. There was a firmness in his steps without arrogance, a silence full of voice. His eyes didn't seek the rich, but the afflicted, the forgotten, and in an instant they stopped. They stopped right under the sycamore. Jesus raised his face. Their eyes met. "Zacchaeus, come down quickly." The name spoken without hate, spoken with love, as if it were a reunion, not a summons. Because today I must stay at your house. The world spun, the crowd's noise faded. Zacchaeus came down. Each step was a breaking, each inch between the branch and the ground marked the end of one man and the beginning of another. The ground of Jericho trembled under the crowd's steps. Dust rose in small clouds as hundreds pushed through narrow streets, trying to glimpse the one who had healed the blind and made the paralyzed walk. The walls vibrated with voices mingled in worship, doubt, and rumors. In the midst of the chaos, Zacchaeus ran, the chief tax collector, the man no one wanted around, not even now. He had tried in vain to get through the crowd, shouted, pushed, pleaded for space. But every face looked at him with contempt. He was like an intruder trying to enter a sanctuary. He wasn't welcome there, not among the devout, not among the pure. He didn't belong in that procession of faith. Even wrapped in fine fabrics, he sweated like a servant. His arms were shoved, eyes judged him, his body stumbled, but something inside, an urgency the world couldn't smother, drove him forward. He had to see, even from afar, even for just a second. At the top of a side alley, he saw a sycamore broad with thick leafy branches common in the hot plains of Judea. Zacchaeus hesitated. The tree stood like a bridge between heaven and shame. Climbing it would be to expose himself, not as a collector but as a human, as fragile, as a sinner. And so he ran, ignored the shouting, ignored the pain in his feet, ignored his pride. He climbed with effort, clutched the branches like a starving boy climbs for bread. His robes tore in places, his skin scratched. Some laughed, others pointed. Look at the tax collector trying to fly, going to charge the leaves as Zacchaeus. But he no longer heard them. From above, through the leaves rustled by the dry wind, he saw at last, he saw Jesus. He didn't come like a general, he wasn't escorted by soldiers. He came on foot surrounded by fishermen, humble women, children, and men marked by suffering. A group so ordinary that only the presence of the Nazarene gave it meaning. Zacchaeus watched every gesture, every step, the way Jesus looked at people as if he knew them before they spoke. It was an authority not born of force, but of truth. And then he stopped. The procession halted, the dust settled. A suspended silence fell over the crowd like a veil. Jesus raised his eyes, straight to the sycamore, straight to the trunk, straight to him. Zacchaeus, come down quickly. The voice was not stern, it was clear, direct, as if calling someone who had waited a long time to be seen. As Zacchaeus froze, he felt the crowd's eyes pierce him like blades. Come down from there, under all the stares of disdain, but also under the one gaze that accepted him. With trembling hands, he climbed down, step by step, like one returning to the ground, not as judge, but as judged, like someone descending not a tree, but his own tower. When his feet touched the ground, he felt the dust on his sandals as a sign of humanity. He looked at Jesus. There was no contempt there, no accusation, only truth and mercy. The crowd murmured, he's going to stay at the house of a sinner. That man robbed families, he doesn't deserve that kind of attention. But Jesus didn't listen to the murmurs. He looked at Zacchaeus as if saying, you are more than this. He walked on with the Master with uncertain steps, but a soul ignited. And as he looked one last time at the sycamore, he understood. The tree had become his ladder of shame, but also his first altar. If this journey has touched you in any way, take this moment to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share. Every gesture helps this message reach more hearts. Now, let's resume the story where it left off. And when they saw it, they all murmured, saying that he was gone to be guest with a man that is a sinner. Luke 19:7. The sun was already leaning over the rooftops of Jericho when Zacchaeus led Jesus to his house. The path, though short, seemed to pass through centuries of silence and guilt. Behind them came eyes that hurt more than stones. Tongues sharp as blades whispered venom into the wind. Is he really going in there? The Master in a thief's house? How long will this scandal last? Zacchaeus' home, rich in Greco-Roman details, stood out among the modest buildings around it. Tall gates, ornate columns, floral mosaics on the floors. But now everything seemed smaller. Everything seemed meaningless. Jesus crossed the courtyard without hesitation. The servants opened the doors with the astonishment of those who see a prophet step where only scorn was expected. The main hall, once the stage for banquets and contracts, was purified by the silent presence of the Nazarene. He didn't speak. He only looked as if inspecting the spirit of the house, not its walls. Zacchaeus, nervous, wiped his forehead with his fist. He ordered water, fruit, fresh bread, but he couldn't look directly at Jesus' face. Something held him inside, as if he was standing before a scale that would finally weigh everything. Jesus sat down. The wooden chair, though noble, seemed unworthy. Around him, a few guests, some servants, other disciples. Bartus, the former blind man, was among them, watching everything with eyes full of light and gratitude. His presence there unsettled Zacchaeus even more. Outside, the crowd remained. Pharisees whispered among themselves. Common men murmured under their breath. The house's facade had now become a courtroom. Inside, the silence was heavy. Zacchaeus tried to break the weight of the moment with a toast. May the Lord, may he be welcome, but his voice failed. The words got lost between guilt and thirst. Jesus looked at him, a gaze that did not accuse, but did not hide the truth. And Zacchaeus broke down. Master, he said breathless, I am not worthy to have you here. I know what they think. I know what I was, what I did. His hands trembled. His eyes avoided the floor. I took bread from families. I sold hope for coins. I turned the law into a tool of oppression. There's not a corner in this house that hasn't heard crying or anger. Jesus remained silent, but something in his presence was already at work. Zacchaeus felt as though the words came from his soul, not his mouth. I wanted respect. I never wanted to see my father cry over debts again. I wanted to be someone, but I became an emptiness, an echo of myself. The tears came. He didn't hold them back. His hands covered his face, but not his shame. I am not worthy. Jesus came closer. He placed his hand on Zacchaeus' shoulder. That touch, simple and light, carried the weight of an entire heaven, and there, in the middle of the room, under suspicious glances, something subtle was born. A seed. Zacchaeus lifted his eyes. For the first time, he saw true compassion, one that didn't deny his errors, but called him to transformation. Outside, the murmurs grew louder. Someone shouted, "He is gone to be a guest of a sinner." Jesus, without leaving his place, replied with a firm voice, "The Son of Man came to seek and to save what was lost." Silence fell over the street. The words echoed like a hammer on stone. Inside the house, Zacchaeus felt that he was no longer just receiving someone, he was being rebuilt. And though he didn't yet know how, he felt that night would be the beginning of everything he never thought he deserved. Redemption, music. The house was quiet. Jesus had already left, and the crowd had reluctantly dispersed, leaving behind whispers that still lingered on the walls. The night fell with an ancestral weight. Not even the oil lamp seemed to dispel the darkness in Zacchaeus' heart. He sat in the empty room, face in his hands. Around him the echoes of the visit still moved like shadows, but now the silence spoke louder than anything, and with it came the ghosts. He closed his eyes, and memory opened like an ancient scroll. He remembered the widows. The first had a dry face and sunken eyes with 2 small children. She owed 2 silver coins. Her husband had died in a harvest accident. Zacchaeus accepted no excuses. He ordered the house taken. He remembered the look on the boys' faces pressed against the wall as Roman guards tore the planks from the door. It's just the law, he had told himself that afternoon. But the crying still echoed. Then the lame blacksmith, an honest Jew faithful to the temple. His workshop was confiscated for being 1 cycle late. He cried on his knees, begging for more time. Zacchaeus turned his back. The next day he heard the man had thrown himself into a well. An elderly woman once came to him with a golden coin wrapped in an old cloth. It was all her family had left. He looked at it, examined it, and refused. Said it didn't even cover the interest. She left in silence. Days later he saw her begging near the east gate. There were dozens, maybe hundreds, men who lost their land, women who sold their mothers' necklaces, youth forced to enlist as debt slaves. In every face, a mark, a story, and he was the common thread in all of them. That office of planks and scrolls had for years been the altar of his own idolatry, an altar watered with others' sweat where he sacrificed others to build himself. Now all of that came back. With each scene a blow, with each memory a wound. He tried to escape, but his own mind locked him in judgment. It was no longer the people accusing him. It was his own conscience. He walked through the house as if fleeing something within. He looked at the ornamental vases, the Persian rugs, the silverware on the table. Everything now seemed tainted. Everything tasted like plunder. A slow, legalized plunder. He sat down again, took a deep breath, and cried. Not like before, restrained, proud tears, but like a child. A raw cry, a weeping that dug deep, like someone digging to bury an old self. In the back room where he kept old scrolls and records, he found the ledgers. He opened them line by line, name by name, dates, amounts, charges. It was all there, an encyclopedia of pain disguised in numbers. He placed his hand on one name, then another, and another. With each touch he felt as though pressing on the victim's chest. He softly recited the rabbinic text he had learned as a boy, "Who does not lend with usury nor accept bribes, he shall dwell on the holy mountain." He stopped. That hurt more than the crowd's insults, more than the cries of the wronged. That was the truth. He didn't dwell anywhere, not on the holy mountain, not in the people's hearts, not even in his own soul. He stood with red eyes, tore a piece of linen, and tied the old scrolls. One by one, he stacked them like remnants of himself, carried them to the courtyard, laid firewood, oil, and flame. The flames rose, devoured the records, the names floated in the ashes, and with them Zacchaeus felt the first breath of freedom. It wasn't forgiveness yet. It was only the beginning of reparation, but as he watched the embers, a certainty settled like a seal on his chest. He would have to face each of those stories by name, by face, with restitution, because justice doesn't begin with words. It begins with outstanding debts. And that night, Zacchaeus decided to start paying them. And Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, "Behold, Lord, I give half of my goods to the poor, and if I have taken anything from anyone by false accusation, I restore it fourfold." Luke 19:8-9. The morning had barely broken when Zacchaeus rose from bed, his eyes sunken and still moist from the previous night. The house was silent, but within him the outcry was deafening. The fire of restitution lit in the courtyard the night before now burned within his chest. He had not slept. Each time he closed his eyes, faces returned, names, debts, doors shut because of him, voices of widows, calloused hands of craftsmen, children driven from their homes. Memory was now a courtroom, and Zacchaeus, the defendant of himself in the courtyard, he summoned the servants. He ordered them to bring the recent records, the chests of coins, the property deeds, the debt contracts. The servants exchanged glances. In silence they had never seen their master with such hollow eyes and such a light face, as if something heavy had finally been lifted in the middle of the whom he piled the possessions. Gold, silver, fine garments, tapestries from Phoenicia, everything. Each item seemed to silently scream the injustices behind its acquisition. Jesus was still in the house, seated in one of the side rooms, surrounded by those approaching in reverence, and the Master's presence had transformed the atmosphere. No vain word was spoken, no mask endured. Zacchaeus entered breathless, readied, empty-handed. He stopped before the Master, took a deep breath, then he stood like someone choosing to be born again, right there among dust and silence. "Lord," his voice faltered at first, but continued steady. I give half of everything I own to the poor." Murmurs began among those present. A tax collector giving up his fortune. It wasn't common, it wasn't expected, it wasn't human. But he went on, "And if I have defrauded anyone, and I know I have defrauded many, I will restore it to them 4 times over." These were not rehearsed words, they were flesh. They were grief turned into decision, a decree born from the soul. The tears flowed silently, no longer tears of shame, they were tears of liberation. Jesus looked at him, not with surprise, but with tenderness, as if he had known this moment long before it came. "Today, salvation has come to this house." Silence filled the room. Even the birds outside seemed to quiet. Those words were not merely spoken, they were sown, planted deep in the soil of the Spirit. Because this man too is a son of Abraham. Jesus' words did not just include him, they restored his identity. Before the Pharisees who called him a traitor, the Nazarene acknowledged him as an heir of the promise. Before the scribes who had cast him out, the Son of Man brought him back into the lineage. The declaration was more than spiritual, it was public, out loud. Before all, Jesus had restored not only Zacchaeus' faith, but his dignity. Zacchaeus fell to his knees, not from burden, but from relief. He knew that repaying 4-fold would mean the end of his wealth. He knew that giving back meant starting over from nothing. But for the first time, the thought of having nothing didn't terrify him. What terrified him was remaining in debt, remaining trapped, remaining the man he once was, and he was no longer that man. He ordered that every servant be sent to the families he had wronged, that each case be reviewed with justice, that the doors he had closed be reopened, that those he had humiliated now receive honor. He knew restitution was the only path to true peace. Outside the people still murmured, but this time something had changed. There was a new tone, a look of doubt, yes, but also curiosity, hope, possibility. Who was this man who gave back without being forced? Who returned without demand, who wept for justice like one weeps for a child? It was Zacchaeus, or perhaps for the first time, it was simply a man saved. The news spread through Jericho with the speed of scandal. The most feared tax collector in the city had returned goods, given back homes, emptied coffers, burned records, and more. He had received Jesus in his home. The comments kept growing. The religious were suspicious. The poor watched from a distance. The powerful were furious. Zacchaeus woke up the day after announcing the restitution with the certainty that inner peace did not erase external consequences. When he entered the account hall where he was once greeted with reverence or fear, He found dry stares, crossed arms, and cutting silence. His senior assistants avoided his gaze. One of them finally spoke. "The Roman tribune wants to see you today." At the city's makeshift garrison, the air was tense. The centurion in charge, with cold eyes and a harsh voice, didn't mince words. "You gave away goods collected under the imperial banner. You touched structures that ensured stability. The empire needs trust, not spiritual crisis." Zacchaeus tried to explain it wasn't rebellion but conscience, that his transformation wasn't against Rome but for justice. The tribune didn't smile. He simply said, "As of today, you no longer hold any position, and without position, there is no protection." Leaving the fortress, he felt the weight of the sentence. It wasn't just dismissal, it was exposure. Without Rome's seal, he was naked before all he had once harmed. People began approaching, not with fear, but with disdain, and some with pent-up anger. Zacchaeus felt the invisible walls that once shielded him collapse one by one. At home, the servants began to leave, some in silence, others leaving short notes about new opportunities or loyalty to Rome. Friends vanished. The younger tax collectors who once revered him now called him insane. A traitor to the machine that built him, they said. Swayed by words, he forgot reality. The days that followed were full of losses. Former businesses dissolved, properties contested. The house once filled with banquets now stood empty. Coins dwindled, reserves dropped, and the name Zacchaeus no longer evoked fear, only suspicion. He began walking alone through the streets, without escort, without arrogance, and for the first time he noticed the faces he once ignored. He saw the woman who had given him coins wrapped in a cloth. He saw the man who had lost his workshop. He saw the orphans, the crippled, the blind, and for the first time he didn't look away. He walked with humility and was viewed with doubt. On one of these walks, 2 young tax collectors followed him. They surrounded him near the square as well. One spat on the ground, the other said, "You shame us. You repented too late," and they spat on him. Zacchaeus didn't react. He wiped his face with his cloak, bowed his head, and walked on in silence. He felt pain, yes, but not anger. It was as if he were paying an invisible debt, one repaid only with steady steps through humiliation. That night, lying on the floor of his room, he remembered Jesus' words, "Today salvation has come to this house." But now the house was empty, the wealth was gone, his reputation in ruins. And still something in him remained at peace. He was no longer the man of gold nor of taxes. He was simply a man, for the first time, alone and free. "How long, O Lord, will you forget me? Forever how long will you hide your face from me?" Psalm 13:11. The walls of the house were bare. The alabaster jars had been sold. Only 2 servants remained, and only out of gratitude. The grand hall that once echoed with laughter and contracts now heard only the slow steps of Zacchaeus. Dust settled in the corners as if claiming ownership. Weeks had passed since Jesus' visit, and since then, silence. No new words, no signs, no presence. Only the echo of a brilliant memory dissolved among increasingly clouded days. He had made restitution, he had wept, he had renounced, and now he waited for something that never came. Zacchaeus sat every afternoon on the same bench on the porch, looking toward the hills to the east. He remembered Jesus' gaze, the tone of voice as he called his name, the hand on his shoulder. It all seemed like a living miracle. But the miracle had gone, and he remained alone. He began to silently question whether he had done the right thing, whether restitution had been worth the cost, whether the abandonment he now felt was just a consequence or an unspoken punishment. After all, what had he gained from it all? The loss of his reputation, the people's distrust, Rome's disdain. His prayers had become monotonous. At first he prayed with fervor, then with pleading, now with doubt, and sometimes not even that. "Lord, what do you want from me now?" he whispered, gazing at the pale sky. No answer, only the sound of wind scraping against the balcony bricks. He felt like David lost in anguish. "How long, Lord? How long will you hide your face from me?" The silence hurt most, not the contempt of others, but the emptiness of divine absence. It was as if he had given up everything and been left with nothing. No glory, no company, only faith. A faith that now wavered. Memories flooded him of banquets, of days of power. He hated who he had been, but couldn't deny it. In those days, he was someone. Now, what was he? A forgotten name, a traitor among traitors, a reformed man alone. One afternoon, passing by the well street, he heard 2 men laughing. One said, "Did you hear what happened to the tax collector? Now, he sells stale bread." All 4 words and promises. Zacchaeus didn't respond, but inside it cut deep. He returned home with slumped shoulders, and that night he didn't pray. He lay in the dark, eyes open, The ceiling felt higher, as if God had ascended and taken all warmth with him. His heart beat without conviction. He breathed only because his body insisted, but his soul was tired. The next day he walked to the eastern gate of the city. He stopped near the same sycamore, looked at the trunk he had once climbed weeks earlier. He remembered the shame, the calling, the hope, all so real, so alive, and yet now so distant. He sat in the shadow of the tree, remained there for hours. Some children played nearby. A beggar slept under a tattered blanket. A dog passed by indifferent. The world moved on, but he didn't. He was stuck in the middle of his own faith. And there, among dry leaves and memories, something whispered within. Not an audible voice, not a vision, just a gentle presence, a fragment of certainty. God's silence was not absence, it was hidden work. He doesn't always speak. Sometimes he builds in the dark. Sometimes he is silent to teach. Sometimes he tests to mature. And maybe Zacchaeus was simply in the middle of the process, not the end. He took a deep breath. He didn't rise immediately, but he wept. And this time, not from despair. He wept for still believing, even without guarantees, even without voices, even without glory. There, under the shadow of the tree that once gave him sight, he relearned to believe, not because of what he felt, but because of what he knew had begun. The streets of Jericho felt colder. That week, Zacchaeus walked along the edges of the city's most forgotten neighborhood. The walls were worn, doors half open, and eyes peeked through cracks with more fear than curiosity. This was where the forgotten lived. Those never counted in the censuses. Those with nothing to repay because they had nothing left. It was in this setting that a young man approached him, thin-patched tunic, firm gaze. "Are you Zacchaeus?" he asked without arrogance. Zacchaeus nodded, expecting another accusation. "We were invited to a supper. They said you were to supper, yes, with some who were touched by the Master. They said it would be good for us to be together." Zacchaeus didn't respond immediately. Something in him hesitated. A stranger's invitation. A supper. In another time he would have declined, but he was no longer that man. And deep down he longed to know if it was still possible to belong. That night he left home with quiet steps, dressed simply, no rings, no adornments, just a man among men. The address led him to a humble house between worn tents. The door was ajar. Inside, low voices, soft laughter, and the smell of baked bread. He entered and saw and didn't know how to react. They were all there, people he knew, not by name, but by records. A woman once dragged through the city, accused of adultery. A man who had lived among tombs, naked and possessed. A former leper whose skin was now clean, though his eyes still remembered exclusion. And Bartimaeus, the blind man who now saw all there around the table, laughing, sharing bread, like brothers, like equals. One of them saw him, smiled, and pointed to an empty seat at the table. Zacchaeus hesitated, but the eyes around the room called him, not with demand, but with compassion. He sat, and no one judged him. The supper began. Bread, olives, dried fish, and fresh water. Nothing noble, but something there nourished more than any banquet. The presence of those who knew what it meant to be forgiven. No one asked how much he had repaid. No one mentioned his collections. No one accused. These were not his creditors. They were the ones who had also been rescued. The woman with the colorful scarf shared how she felt when Jesus defended her before stones meant to kill. The former demoniac laughed, recalling that his first clear word was water. The leper said that after the Master's touch, he spent 3 days in silence, just feeling the wind on his skin. Zacchaeus listened, and for the first time, he didn't feel smaller or greater, just equal. When they asked how he had been called, he told them about the sycamore, the shame, the voice that called his name, the restitution, and later the silence, the fear of having lost everything. The woman placed her hand on his. She said, "We all thought his silence was abandonment, but it was care. He didn't disappear, he just let us grow with what he had already planted." The words echoed deep that night when the supper ended. No one left in haste. Some slept right there lying on mats. Others walked off in pairs, whispering stories. Zacchaeus walked home alone, but his heart no longer carried that solitary weight. In the back of his mind, an old rabbinic teaching came to the surface. His father used to repeat it, "Judge every person favorably." And there, at that supper, he had been judged with mercy. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and then remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to your brother. Matthew 5:23-24. The heat in Jericho was dry and relentless that late afternoon. Zacchaeus walked through narrow alleys, a bundle of barley bread in his hands and his thoughts far away. Since the supper with the redeemed, something within him had settled. But there were old wounds still untouched. and he knew it wasn't enough to return gold and land. He needed to restore dignity wherever possible. That's when he saw him from behind, carrying a basket of crooked firewood, broad shoulders, shaved head, firm gait. Even after years, Zacchaeus recognized him. The name surfaced like a splinter. Eliab, a just man, a carpenter, father of 3. Zacchaeus remembered clearly the day he ordered the auction of Eliab's house. Over a debt that had dragged on for 2 years, the house was sold, the family separated. Leb at the time cursed him publicly, and he was heard. That day even the soldiers went silent. Zacchaeus stopped, his chest tightening. He didn't know whether to keep going, but his feet moved on their own. When Eliab noticed him, his eyes hardened. "You," the voice came out like a dry blade. Zacchaeus said nothing, he only nodded, stopping a few steps away. "Come to take what's left," Eliab spat on the ground. "Or here for my firewood?" "No." Zacchaeus's voice barely came out. "I came to listen." Eliab laughed without humor. "Listen, now you listen." The carpenter dropped the basket harshly, approached. "You know where my children are now. One became a servant in Sepphoris, the other rushed into marriage with a man 20 years older just to have a roof. The youngest died of fever in a village far from here. No mother, no home, no peace, all because of what you did." Zacchaeus lowered his eyes. The words hit his chest like stones. "I have no defense, only pain, only repentance." Eli pushed him hard. Zacchaeus stumbled but didn't react. "You destroyed my house. I know. You erased my name from the city, turned me to dust. I know. And if I could turn back time, I would." The silence between them hung like a stormy sky. Eliab's eyes trembled with rage and pain. But standing before him was not the old, arrogant tax collector. It was a broken man, an opener man who owned his guilt, who didn't defend himself. "I restored everything I could," said Zacchaeus. "Houses, goods, money. But there are things you can't repay with gold. Only with presence, with truth, with listening." Eliab took a deep breath. His clenched fist slowly opened. "Do you believe God forgave you?" Zacchaeus hesitated. "I believe he started something in me, but I still need to be reconciled with those I've wounded." Eliab's eyes glistened, not with tears, with humanity. "Then start now. Listen to me." And he spoke, told how he gathered his children on the road, how he wept not knowing what to do, how he cursed Zacchaeus' name for years, how he wished for revenge, and how slowly his hardened heart began to crack upon seeing that man before him with no guard, no shield, just an open face. When he finished, Zacchaeus remained silent. Then he knelt. "I can't erase what I did, but I can stand beneath your pain." Eliab stood still for a moment, then, without warning, helped him up and simply said, "Go in peace. But don't forget, never." In that encounter, there was no embrace, no shed tears, but there was something greater. Forgiveness, not as emotion, but as a decision. And turning the corner, Zacchaeus understood that every step in his new life would pass through the hands of those he had wounded. And only then would he be whole again. The room was empty. All that remained was a wooden chest, a modest cloak, and a small leather pouch with a few coins. Zacchaeus sat on the cold floor, barefoot, eyes fixed on that small object with so much weight. The coin. For years, that symbol had been his security. With it, he had bought influence, silence, fear. It had been his tool of control. The coin wasn't just metal, it was language, it was power. It was the unspoken deity of his former life. Now, it was all that was left. The mansion had been sold. The buyer was a Syrian merchant who didn't care about the rumors surrounding the property. The sales value was divided into small sums. Zacchaeus prepared envelopes with names handwritten one by one, delivered by humble messengers or by his own hands whenever possible. Each delivery was more than restitution. It was a silent confession. No speeches, no justifications, just a direct look, a quiet bow, and the coin. Some received it with surprise, others with tears. Some refused, but Zacchaeus insisted. He had learned through the words of the rabbis that one who wrongs in public must restore in public, and he had wronged many. The last coin in the pouch stayed with him for a while. He looked at it as one contemplates a decision. The metal, round and worn, reflected a bit of the sunset's light flooding the small room. It was his final reserve, the last trace of the wealth that had once ruled his life. Now it symbolized something deeper. He remembered the widow who had approached him months earlier after the restitution. She took the coin, looked into his eyes, and said, "This doesn't pay for what I lost, but it pays for what you've become." Zacchaeus carried those words like a tattoo on his soul. That afternoon he went to the market. The vendors were closing their stalls. Leftover vegetables and fabrics lay scattered on the ground. Barefoot children played between baskets. An old beggar played a stringed instrument with only 2 notes. The sound was monotonous but full of humanity. Zacchaeus approached, sat beside him, took out the last coin, and placed it in the man's hands. The old man smiled, didn't ask for his name, didn't recognize his face, just smiled. "The world is finding its place again," he said softly, as if speaking to himself. Zacchaeus stood up, and for the first time since letting everything go, he felt light. There was nothing more to give. No coins, no documents, no explanations. What remained now was his own body, his own life. The emptiness of the house no longer brought anguish. The absence of titles or protection didn't wound him because now what he carried was not what he owned, but what had been restored inside him. That night he lay on the simple floor of his new home, a small house on the outskirts of Jericho among fig trees and stones. No guard at the door, no gold hidden away. But there was peace, silent, persistent, unexplainable. And as he closed his eyes, he remembered the coin, the last one. The one that slipped from his fingers, not as a loss, but as a liberation. And he smiled because finally Zacchaeus was no longer a man who possessed. He was a man possessed by grace. If this story has made you reflect, don't forget, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear this truth. Your support sustains this mission. Now we continue with the next chapters of this extraordinary journey. Then the band and the captain and officers of the Jews took Jesus and bound him. John 18:12. Mornings in Jericho had returned to their usual rhythm. The market regained its color. Romans patrolled the streets and religious leaders returned to their pulpits. For many, the city had resumed its natural order. But for Zacchaeus, nothing was the same. He no longer walked in haste. He moved as one who meditates with his steps with less weight, but with more awareness. That morning, while buying dried dates from a widow he had helped months earlier, he heard a whisper that pierced his soul. "They've arrested the Nazarene." The phrase hit like lightning in the clear sky. Zacchaeus froze. He looked around. More murmurs spread. "They say it happened at dawn in Gethsemane," whispered a merchant. "Soldiers, spears, torches. They arrested him like a thief." The Sanhedrin wants a rushed trial. Before Passover, Zacchaeus felt his body turn cold. His hands trembled. For a moment he forgot the world around him. Only one name, Jesus, spun in his mind like an open wound. He dropped the fruit basket and walked. He didn't know where, only that he had to move. The ground seemed to drift from under his feet. His breath shortened. How could they arrest the one who freed others? He sat on a stone bench under an almond tree, remembered the first time he saw him, the tree, the call, the undeniable presence that had restored his life. That man wasn't just a teacher. He was light. Zacchaeus looked at the faces around him. No one seemed shaken. It was as if the world didn't understand what had been taken from him. How could they treat this like just another arrest? Another agitator? Was that all they thought of him? A servant approached running. "Master Zacchaeus, it's confirmed. He's in Jerusalem with Caiaphas. The trial is secret." Zacchaeus stood up. Part of him wanted to run to Jerusalem, another knew they wouldn't let him near. But the greatest pain was the helplessness. There was no money, influence, or restitution that could change that scene. Jesus was being treated like a criminal, and he, Zacchaeus, could do nothing. The hours passed slowly. News came in fragments. False witnesses, the accused silence, punches, humiliations. Religious authorities moved quickly, as if afraid the people would discover the truth. Zacchaeus remembered Jesus' gaze in his home, the silence full of power, the firm voice declaring, "Today salvation has come to this house." And now would salvation be crucified? At dusk, Zacchaeus returned to his simple home. He sat on the floor as he did every day. But this time there was no peace, only agony. He took a piece of parchment and tried to write. He couldn't. His hand shook. Words wouldn't come. His chest ached as if something was being ripped from inside. "Why, Lord?" he whispered into the darkness. "Why do you allow this? Why is the righteous treated as guilty?" He closed his eyes, hoped for an answer, a sign. But only silence came. A silence unlike what he had known weeks before. Not the silence of rebuilding, it was the silence of injustice declared. And then he wept. Not for himself, but for him. Because even after everything, the world still chose to keep the darkness. Jerusalem boiled. The smell of blood and leaven mixed with dust, sweat, and anticipation. It was Passover, and the streets were swollen like wombs, ready to birth something terrible. Zacchaeus moved through alleys and corridors, breathless, restless, like a man searching for air in a collapsing tunnel. He had arrived from Jericho at dawn, traveled in haste, driven by an anguish he couldn't explain, only obey. Jesus was here, and they set about to be judged. The sun had barely warmed the walls when the shouts began. "Crucify him!" Zacchaeus froze. The sound came from the outer courtyard of the Torium. He ran there. The crowd pressed forward, shoving like a frenzied herd. Up front, Pontius Pilate struggled to maintain a pose of control. Beside him, a man bleeding, crown of thorns, torn robes, swollen face. It was him, Jesus. Zacchaeus couldn't breathe. His legs gave way. He leaned against a column, trying to comprehend. "Release Barabbas," someone yelled. "Give us the murderer and take the prophet." Another shouted. Zacchaeus recognized faces. Men who once whispered insults at him in the squares. Women who once looked away when he passed. Young people who once spat at the sound of his name. Now they called for the death of the righteous. The sound of the crowd was more brutal than any lash. The cries repeated with religious fervor as if bloodlust were an act of worship. "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Like a cursed mantra, Pilate washed his hands. Zacchaeus saw the gesture, a symbol, an abandonment. The crowd surged when the Roman soldiers dragged Jesus inside, preparing him for execution. Zacchaeus didn't stay to see the end. He felt sick. He knelt on the steps, eyes down, fists clenched. "How?" he whispered. "How can they reject the light? How can they prefer darkness?" A woman stumbled beside him. She wept loudly, held a blood-stained cloth. Zacchaeus helped her up. "He healed me," she said. "My daughter wasn't breathing, and he touched her. And now they do this." Zacchaeus had no reply. No word made sense. He rose and walked down side streets, avoiding the densest parts of the crowd. Along the way, more voices, more judgments, more Pharisees stirring fury with promises of purity and revenge. Everything was manipulated. Justice had been hijacked by convenience. The words of Flavius Josephus about other trials came to mind. It wasn't the first time crowds were summoned, not to discern, but to crush. Leaders unjustly accused handed over to the mob under veiled orders, while the powerful washed their hands. And now Zacchaeus saw it happen again, but this time with the only righteous one he had ever known. Crossing a small alley, he heard a young man argue with his father. He did nothing. The master didn't lie, didn't hurt, didn't betray. "Be quiet," replied the father. "The Sanhedrin knows what it's doing. Trust the wise." Zacchaeus stopped for a moment, looked at the sky. It was clear, blue, calm, as if the heavens ignored the tragedy rising below. And in that contrast, something tore inside. The certainty that the world doesn't always cry for justice. Sometimes it cries for convenience, for fear, for comfort, and it crucifies what threatens the familiar, even if that something is the truth. Zacchaeus leaned against a wall and wept, alone, quietly. The same people who once condemned him without mercy now rejected the one who had rescued him with mercy. There was no logic, only pain. And in that pain, Zacchaeus decided he would not remain silent, not there, not afterward, even if his voice was drowned out, even if the world didn't want to hear. Because if the righteous was being crucified, someone had to at least remember what he had done. And when they came to the place called the Skull, there they crucified him, and the criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. And Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Luke 23-334. Deep path to Golgotha was long, not because of the steps, but because of the weight of horror. Zacchaeus walked among the bushes, hidden, his feet covered in dust, and his heart crushed. He couldn't get close to the crowd. He couldn't see Jesus up close, but he needed to be there. He needed to witness with his own eyes what the world did to the light. The sun was high, but the sky seemed darker. A strange silence hung over Jerusalem. Even among the shouting and mockery, there was something in the air that felt heavy, as if even time was hesitating to move forward. From the top of a hill among the rocks, Zacchaeus saw the cross and him. The body of Jesus hung between two men. His arms stretched out, nailed, his skin torn, his shoulders marked by scourging. Blood ran down his sides. But what hurt the most was the look. Even from afar, Zacchaeus could see his eyes weren't closed, and they weren't filled with hatred either. It was as if they were still looking at people. With mercy, Zacchaeus fell to his knees. His chest burned. The weeping came like a storm. How could this be? The one who restored, who called people by name, who sat at the table with sinners, who was now lifted up as if he were the worst of criminals. "No, no," he murmured, his forehead pressed to the ground. The voices below reached him like thorns. "Save yourself. Come down from the cross. If you are the Christ, where are your disciples now?" And then the voice he would never forget, weak but firm, coming from the center of the pain, from the heart of the cross. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Zacchaeus held his face, his body trembling. That pierced his soul. Forgiveness still, even there, with torn wrists and a suspended body. Jesus still interceded for those who were destroying him. It was the cry of the righteous, not for revenge, not for earthly justice. It was a cry for mercy, for the blind, who mocked the only vision that could save them. Zacchaeus remembered himself in the tree amid laughter and scorn, the voice that had called him, the gaze that had welcomed him. And now seeing that same man crushed, humiliated, stripped of everything except compassion, was a pain greater than any condemnation. People went up and down the hill. Some laughed, others cried, some just watched. But for Zacchaeus, it was as if the whole world had stopped there being judged, and he felt guilt for having been part of the system that fueled this violence, for having looked at men and women as numbers, for having spent years supporting the empire that now crucified the innocent. The sun began to fade. A supernatural shadow covered the sky. The earth seemed to bear something much greater than an execution. It was a collision of kingdoms. Zacchaeus remained there motionless until his knees hurt, until the dust clung to his skin, until the voice ceased, until Jesus' head fell. Zacchaeus' heart broke there for the last time, not as weakness, but as surrender. Something died inside him, something old, something that would not return. And there, among rocks and wind, he made a silent vow, never to forget that cry, never to let the world erase what he had seen with his own eyes. The wind that passed through Jerusalem that late afternoon brought no relief. It was a warm, heavy wind, as if it carried the earth's sorrow in its own breath. Zacchaeus walked slowly through the fields, away from the crowd. The body of Jesus had been taken down from the cross, and now the world seemed to spin without direction. There had been no turmoil at the burial. Joseph of Arimathea, with silent courage, had asked Pilate for the body. Nicodemus had brought oils and myrrh. The tomb was new, carved in stone, as was the custom. No ornaments, no excess, just the cave, the linen, and the silence. Zacchaeus watched from a distance. There was no place for him in that procession. He was not a relative nor an acknowledged disciple. He was just a man marked by everything Jesus had done inside him. And now what remained? The stone had been rolled, the body laid to rest. The weeping had been restrained, as the law required during the days leading up to Passover. But morning respected no calendar. Zacchaeus sat beneath an olive tree, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He felt the weight of the world on his chest. He had wept before for his own guilt, for the injustice, for the restitution. But now it was different. Now it was absence. Jesus was no longer there. All his life, Zacchaeus had learned that righteousness came through obedience, that divine favor was earned through rituals, fasting, and purity. But with Jesus, he had discovered another righteousness, one that saw the sinner before the sin, that called people by name, that restored with touch and presence. And now that presence lay behind a cold stone. His heart asked silently, now what? The city little by little resumed its rhythm. Fires were lit. Families prepared for the Passover meal. But Zacchaeus felt no celebration. He felt exile. He was caught between what had been and what was yet to be, between memory and hope, and that in-between hurt. He remembered an old custom. In mourning feet were bare, and the seat was low. Weeping was allowed for 7 days. Friends would come but not speak first. They would just sit. Silence was honor. And at that moment, even alone, Zacchaeus honored the absence with the silence of an open heart. Night fell. The city murmured in the distance as if on a different plane. The stars lit up, indifferent to human pain. But one of them perhaps was watching. Zacchaeus thought of returning to Jericho to resume his simple life. But what was life now? Handing out coins again, walking through fields and pretending everything went on. It was impossible. Jesus had changed everything, and with his death, he had taken with him any old idea of normally. He picked up a handful of earth, let it slip through his fingers. If only he would say something, he murmured, but the stone was sealed, and the sky silent. Zacchaeus didn't know that in the tradition of the wise, God's silence in mourning was not absence. It was reverence. It was as if the eternal also wept, as if heaven itself went quiet before injustice. He lay down under the olive tree, his head resting on the root, his body covered with his own cloak. He didn't expect dreams. He just wanted time to pass. But within his chest, among the ruins of grief, a spark persisted, almost imperceptible, almost unwelcome. What if this wasn't the end? Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Luke 24:5-6. The morning was still rising timidly when Zacchaeus' door was knocked on forcefully. He was sitting on the floor, wrapping a piece of cloth around his feet to bear the cold. He wasn't expecting visitors. In fact, he wasn't expecting anything. The door creaked as it opened. A young man, breathless, face dusty, eyes wide. They say the tomb is empty. Zacchaeus didn't understand at first. He stood up slowly like someone waking inside a dream. What tomb? His, the Nazarene, Jesus. The women went early to the tomb and found the stone rolled away and 2 men in white. They said, "He has risen." The air fled Zacchaeus' lungs. For a moment, the pain that had accompanied him for days seemed to lose its meaning. He blinked several times, trying to make sense of what he'd heard. The women, did they see the body? He asked cautiously. No, there's no body, just the wrappings, the linens, and the message. Why do you seek the living among the dead? Zacchaeus sat again, but the floor felt distant. His heart beat fast. He wanted to believe. Part of him longed with all its strength, but another feared morning was safer than hope. To hope again hurt. What if it was a lie? He stood up with sudden urgency. Where are the disciples hiding? Some say Peter went to the tomb and confirmed it, but others don't know what to think. Zacchaeus left immediately. The streets were calm, but there was a strange murmur in the air, the kind of noise that comes before revolutions or miracles. He walked through alleys to the neighborhood where the followers usually gathered. He knocked on doors, waited, was ignored by some until a woman opened a crack. You're Zacchaeus, he nodded. She opened the door wider. Come in, but speak softly. The room was small, dark. 4 men sat inside, one with eyes red. From crying, Peter Zacchaeus recognized him immediately. None of them spoke, but their eyes said everything. They were caught between fear and fire. Is it true? Asked Zacchaeus. He lives. Peter raised his eyes. I saw the tomb, saw the cloths. He is not there, but I also denied him. And even so, he lives. One of the others added, he appeared to the women, and maybe he'll appear to us. He has overcome. Zacchaeus didn't respond. He felt himself floating inside as if something that had been dormant since the crucifixion was slowly awakening. A flame still faint but real. He didn't ask for explanations or proof. He simply sat among them, and there among those who also wavered, who also feared, who also loved, Zacchaeus felt that something inside him was beginning to come back to life. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and prayed. He asked for nothing. He simply gave thanks. He had not appeared to him, no vision, no voice in the night, no hand passing through walls. While others spoke of encounters, of burning hearts when breaking bread, of unexplainable signs, Zacchaeus only had silence. But that silence was no longer despair, it was direction. Since the day he heard of the resurrection, something had changed, not because of proof, but because of impulse, as if the visible absence of Jesus had become an inner presence. He no longer needed to see, he needed to live as if he had seen. He started with the alleys. He walked in silence, as he had done many times before, but now for a different reason. He looked into faces he used to avoid, dust-covered children, mothers carrying babies in their arms, elderly forgotten in corners. There were the first listeners, the only ones who, like him, knew what it meant to have no worth. He sat on steps, shared bread, listened to stories, and then he spoke little, with simplicity, without citing laws, without repeating formulas. He called me by name. He once said, before I changed, before I made restitution, he saw me, and even seeing it all, he loved me. People looked at him strangely. A former tax collector now preaching mercy, but the sincerity in Zacchaeus' eyes was undeniable. He didn't speak like the Pharisees or the scribes. He spoke like someone rescued from the ruins, and wanting to lead others back. He drew inspiration from the teachings he heard from the disciples. He repeated what he remembered carefully. Living as children of light, loving those who hate us, sharing what we have, not killing, not with weapons, not with words, judging others as we would judge ourselves. The way, as they had begun to call it, was not doctrine, it was practice. He remembered a passage a young man had read to him from the Dade newly written in rudimentary copies. There are 2 ways, one of life and one of death. The difference between them is great. Zacchaeus knew what it meant to walk the way of death. For years he had walked it with conviction. Now the other way, the way of life, seemed narrow, simple, almost invisible, but safe. He didn't speak in public, didn't stand on platforms. His preaching was through gestures, through shared bread, through a tunic offered, through listening, through embrace. Many mocked. The tax collector turned saint, now going to teach us about repentance. But he smiled because he understood. He understood resistance, he understood sarcasm. He too had once mocked everything he couldn't control. His days became small acts of redemption, a coin discreetly left at a widow's door, a jug of water carried for a tired mother, a son of an enemy welcomed with bread. None of this required a heavenly vision, only the courage to keep faith even without seeing him. At night alone he prayed, Lord, even though I haven't seen you since the tomb, I know you have risen, and that is enough for me. Zacchaeus would never say he was a teacher or an apostle or a prophet, but he had become something else, a witness without proof, but with truth. And that in the end was what moved hearts the most. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. Matthew 5-9. The stones on the path felt harder that morning. Zacchaeus carried a bag of fresh bread and dates, his hands sweaty and his heart racing. It wasn't his first visit since his conversion, but this one was different. The man's name was Melchior, a well-known weaver, respected for his skill and feared for his frankness. Years ago he had fallen behind on his taxes due to an illness that spread among his children. Zacchaeus, cold and methodical, refused any extension. He ordered the house to be seized. The family was evicted in the rain. One of the sick children died a few days later. Since then Melchior's eyes held more than pain, they held hatred. Now there was Zacchaeus knocking on the same door he once ordered sealed. Melchior's wife answered, her face aged, her expression cautious. Her eyes fell on the bag in his hands. She recognized him immediately. The silence between them was heavier than any scream. "I came, if you'll allow me, just to listen," said Zacchaeus, not looking directly into her eyes. She hesitated, but stepped aside. The house was modest. One main room, few pieces of furniture, the scent of linen and stale bread. In the back, sitting on a low chair, was his back hunched, beard now white, but his eyes still burned. Zacchaeus approached slowly. He offered no apology or speech. He placed the bag on the table, lowered his head, and knelt. "I didn't come to collect, I came to serve." Melchior didn't respond. The silence was thick. His wife sat beside him, uneasy. "I destroyed your home," Zacchaeus continued in a low voice. "No coin can repay what I lost by not listening. But today I came to hear whatever you wish to say. And if it's your will to serve this house however I can." Melchior laughed a dry, humorous laugh. "You want to serve now, after throwing us into the street, after watching my son die homeless?" Zacchaeus closed his eyes. The words were knives but deserved, yes. "Now because the one who called me by name taught me not to run from the wounds I caused. And this one, Melchior, this is one of the deepest." The weaver stood with difficulty, walked up to him. For a moment Zacchaeus thought he'd be thrown out or struck, but Melchior simply stopped in front of him. "Why now?" he asked. Zacchaeus looked up. "Because now I am a broken man, and it was in my ruin that I found peace. Not the peace of someone who forgets, but of someone who refuses to repeat evil." The old man looked at his wife. Then, at the table, he touched the bag, opened it, took out a piece of bread. He broke it in half, and extended one half to Zacchaeus. "Sit, eat, and tell me, who is this that changed you so much?" Zacchaeus sat, ate, in silence, then spoke of the sycamore, the calling, the restitution, the fire burning, the records, the silence of God, the cross, the tomb, and the hope. The wife cried silently. Melchior listened intently. When the story ended, he simply said, "The son who died was named Barnatan, the youngest. He had eyes like yours now. I see him every time I wake up." Zacchaeus couldn't hold back the tears. He took the old man's hands in his. "May my life now be a memory of all I once neglected." Mal nodded. "If you stay on this path, you're already paying, but not out of debt, out of love." And there, with no need for a declared forgiveness, peace was born. A peace of bare feet, of shed bread, of eyes that no longer avoid the past, but redeem it. It was a clear afternoon, one of those when the sky looks like blue glass and the wind blows gently. Zacchaeus walked along the dirt road leading to the communal well, carrying 2 simple jars. He had taken that path many times since choosing to live among the poor, but that day would be different. As he reached the slope, he noticed 3 men in the distance, standing still, long robes, well-kept cloaks, leather belts with Hebrew inscriptions. Zacchaeus's heart tightened. He recognized the type, not the faces, but the kind. Pharisees, or worse, radical sympathizers, men zealous for the law but blind to mercy. He looked away and continued, but their footsteps echoed behind him, grew louder, came closer. "Look who walks among us," said Tall with a mocking voice. "The tax collector turned prophet," sneered another, "going to preach about restitution again." Zacchaeus stopped, not out of fear, but because he knew what was coming. He turned slowly. "I'm not here to preach, just to get water." "Water," said the third, spitting on the ground. "The only thing you carried was shame. And now you want to wash away sins at the public well." Without warning, the first stone was thrown, small, but it hit his legs squarely. Zacchaeus didn't cry out. He only clenched his eyes shut. The second came quickly to his shoulder. Then another larger struck his face. He fell. Sand entered his mouth, his eyes. The taste was dry, salty, bitter. The jars shattered. One of the men came closer and kicked his side. "As for every home you took, for every promise you broke, for every teaching you dishonored with this false conversion." Zacchaeus remained on the ground, hands protecting his head, body curled. But he didn't scream, he didn't fight back. Instead, he prayed, "Lord, not for me, but for them. They still don't see, as I once didn't, The words were whispers between broken teeth, but they came from within. They came pure. The attackers, perhaps out of boredom, perhaps out of contempt, walked away, laughed as they vanished down the rocky trail. Zacchaeus remained there covered in blood and sand. The pain throbbed, but there was something new in that pain. Purpose. It wasn't unjust. It was part of it. His mind recalled old tales from the Talmud. Jews who upon approaching new teachings were expelled from synagogues, cursed in assemblies, persecuted by neighbors, traitors to purity, said those who had never felt grace. And now he understood. He understood every shard of stone, every spit, every complicit silence. But he did not hate them. On the contrary, he felt compassion because what he had seen, what he had heard, what he had lived in Christ could no longer be denied. Some time later, a little girl ran down the road. She stopped when she saw him, approached slowly. She was the daughter of one of the men too, whom he had made restitution. She carried a cloth, touched his arm. "Uncle, do you need help?" Zacchaeus smiled. One of his lips split. "Yes, little one, I do." She helped him up slowly with effort. He returned home. Each step a reminder of the ground. Each pain a certainty that the cross hadn't ended in death. It continued in those who chose to live like Christ. As he lay down that night, bandaged, exhausted, he murmured, "Lord, if your road has stones, may I never leave the path." And he slept with sand in his hair and tears in his eyes, but peace in his heart. If something in this message is stirring something inside you, click to subscribe, leave your like and share. Your action is a seed that can help reach more lives. Let's continue. There is still much to be revealed. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. John 3:3. Time had passed, not as much as an old man might call a lifetime, but enough that Zacchaeus was no longer remembered as a tax collector. Wrinkles now shaped his face. His steps were shorter, and his gaze carried that serenity that comes only to those who have lost everything, and still found meaning. He walked alone along the trails of Jericho on a dry autumn afternoon, his staff marking the rhythm. The wind blew gently, lifting dry leaves that danced briefly before settling on the ground. It happened by chance, or perhaps not, that he came upon the sycamore. He stopped. The branches were larger now, the trunk wider, but it was the same tree, the very same, the one that years earlier had sheltered him in his escape and exposed him in his shame. The tree where he had hidden from the crowd, and was called by Jesus. He approached slowly, ran his wrinkled hand along the rough bark, touched the marks, felt the texture, closed his eyes. It was like touching his own soul. He stood there in silence. The wind rustling the leaves made a sound almost like a whisper. The memory was vivid, intact. The crowd, the insults, the climb, the gaze, the voice. "Zacchaeus, come down quickly. I was born again here," he murmured. "Here I died to what I was, and was born into what I never knew I could be." A soft crack broke the moment. A boy was approaching, thin, curious face, bare feet, and a stick made of a dry branch in hand. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked timidly. Zacchaeus smiled, still with his hand on the tree. "I am just remembering what." Zacchaeus hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. This would be the first time he spoke it aloud. "The first time I was truly seen." The boy sat on a nearby stone, eyes fixed on him. Zacchaeus pointed to the canopy. "I was a small man, not just in height. My heart was small too. I thought only of myself, of having control. One day Jesus passed by here, and I wanted to see him, but the people hated me. So I climbed this tree, hid among the branches." He paused, and it was there, exactly there, that he saw me. He stopped, looked up, and called me by name, Zacchaeus. He didn't shout, didn't accuse, just called like someone recognizing a child. The boy's eyes lit up, and then Zacchaeus knelt down with effort and looked the boy in the eyes. Then my life was never the same. I came down from that branch a new man, and I spent my life trying to honor that gaze. I gave back what I stole, embraced those I had offended, was hated for it, suffered, but never regretted it. The boy was quiet, then asked, "Does he still call people by name?" Zacchaeus smiled, looked at the sky. "Even today, even now, even those who did a lot of wrong. Especially those who did a lot of wrong." Silence returned. The boy stood up, thanked him with a nod, and ran toward the village, his stick tapping the ground with each step. Zacchaeus remained there for a while longer, then lay in the sycamore shade, looked up at the branches he once climbed. He felt light, not because pain was absent, but because he was full. He remembered Jesus' words to Nicodemus, "Unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God." And there beneath that tree, Zacchaeus knew that he already saw it. And when Jesus felt their unbelief, he said, "Who are my helpers in the way of God?" Quran Surah ke-352. Jericho remained almost the same. its mud walls, the scent of ripe dates, the muffled sound of wheels on narrow streets. But something new was growing. Invisible, silent, like roots beneath the ground. A circle. Zacchaeus walked with slow steps, hunched but attentive. He was now known in the streets, no longer as the feared collector, but as the man with the steady gaze and the silence that listens. And that morning, the unexpected, at the edge of the central fountain, seated under a makeshift canopy, was Bartimaeus, the former blind man. The two looked at each other for a moment. A smile bloomed in both. No explanations were needed. The reunion was natural, as if the years had only matured what had been planted on the road to Jerusalem. "Still see clearly?" asked Zacchaeus, sitting beside him. "More than ever," replied Bartimaeus, "and you still hear that voice?" Zacchaeus looked at the sky, squinting against the sun. "It still echoes, as if it's in everything." They talked for hours, remembered the calling, the words, the glances, Jesus' presence. And soon others gathered. First a veiled woman, he who had been healed from a violent fever. Then a man once hunched under guilt, who now spoke with gentleness. Ordinary people marked by grace. They sat in a circle under a fig tree. No titles, no positions, just witnesses, voices united by memories of redemption. "And do you remember when he said, 'Who are my helpers in the way of God?'" The woman said softly. "I used to think he meant kings, prophets. I never imagined he was speaking about us." "But we are," added Zacchaeus. "Every time we remember what he did, we become the living answer to that question." The circle grew. Some came with questions, others just to listen. Children sat in the middle, lay on their mothers' laps. It was simple, warm, real. There was no doctrinal debate. They shared life, spoke of forgiveness, of loss, of healing, of failure, and all of them, without exception, knew they were alive, not just in body, but in soul. Bartimaeus raised his voice once. "I was blind, and the world was a shapeless sound. When he called me, my darkness turned to color. Today I see." But the greatest miracle was being seen before I could see. Zacchaeus listened and nodded. Then he spoke. "I had everything and was empty. When he called me, he didn't ask me to change, just to come down. And when I touched the ground, I found heaven." The circle fell silent. It was a sacred moment, without temple, without altar, but sacred. At sunset, when I began to leave, a young woman said, "We should do this more often. Meet, tell the stories again, share what he did." "Yes," Zacchaeus replied, "because memory is the bread that feeds faith." And so, without an official name, without pretense, the circle was born. A space of faith, remembrance, and communion. A space where the marks left by Jesus found a voice. Zacchaeus returned home late, tired, but at peace. Before sleeping, he knelt and whispered, "If I am your helper, Lord, then keep using me, even without a pulpit, even without applause, just with what's left of me." The smell of the city had changed. Before it was the scent of spices, of baked bread, of the wildflowers surrounding Jericho. Now the air carried ashes, ashes of tension, of an empire in decline, of a false peace that was beginning to crack at the edges. Zacchaeus sensed it in the faces, in the quieter streets, in the more restless soldiers, and in the words spoken in hushed tones. "Rome is weakening. Antipas is dead. Judea is about to erupt." The death of Herod Antipas had created a vacuum, and a vacuum in Roman power was like a dry field in summer. Any spark could set it ablaze. Rebels were gaining strength. Zealots trained in the shadows of palm trees. And the old Pharisees resumed their speeches, thirsty not for justice, but of vengeance, Zacchaeus observed. But he did not fear. He had already faced the greatest war of his life, the one within his own heart. Now he walked among the rubble of social tensions like a survivor who refused to let the last remnants of well burn. Many came to him, some to ask his opinion on the political moment, others hoping he would lead a revolt since he had once held influence over taxes and men. But Zacchaeus always gave the same answer in a calm voice. "I am no longer a tax collector, nor a rebel. I am a peacemaker." "Peace," they scoffed. "What peace? Look around you. The empire is cracking. The priests are corrupt, and the people bleed." Peace died with the prophets. Zacchaeus looked them in the eyes and replied firmly, "Peace still lives within those who refuse to stop sowing it." He remembered the words he had heard, the teachings whispered in quiet houses, the memories shared in the circles. The good news still ran even through the smoke, and wherever it passed, it left traces. Forgiveness where there was resentment, bread where there had been greed, reconciliation where there had only been vengeance. One day he was called to the square by a small group of merchants in conflict with local tax collectors. Tensions were on the brink of violence. Some young men armed with stones had already formed a line. Zacchaeus arrived empty-handed. "Who are you blaming today?" he asked. "Those demanding tribute even with Rome weakened," shouted one. "Those taking advantage of the chaos to extort," said another. Zacchaeus picked up one of the stones from the ground, held it up to eye level, and said, "This stone can knock a man down, but it cannot raise up a people." Silence. "I know well what it means to demand what, and another cannot give. I was once the man behind the unjust scales, and I learned that when you raise your hand to strike, even with reason, you lose the chance to heal." The crowd fell silent. The stones dropped, and a man stepped forward, touching Zacchaeus' shoulder. "What right do you have to say this?" "The right of someone who was forgiven and does not want to waste that grace." The tension dissipated, and not by force, but by the presence of someone who had already seen death from the inside, and came back changed. In the days that followed, Zacchaeus continued making his rounds, visiting broken homes, helping repair roofs, sharing food, listening to stories. He never spoke as an authority, but as a living reminder that it is possible to be born again, even in the midst of collapse. And when asked if he feared war, he replied, "The empire may fall, but those who build the kingdom remain for a day. In your courts is better than 1,000 elsewhere. I would rather stand at the threshold of the house of my God than dwell in the tents of wickedness." Psalm 84:10. It was autumn in Jerusalem. The leaves danced on the ground like farewells, and the wind blew softly as if it knew that this day needed silence. Zacchaeus walked slowly through the streets of the holy city. He hadn't returned there in years. The stones seemed the same, the walls as imposing as he remembered, but he was no longer the same. He climbed toward the temple. His knees no longer had the strength of youth, but his heart beat with the power of someone reborn. Each step was a memory of his father who had taken him to the temple as a child of himself, still a boy trying to grasp the grandeur of the place, and of Jesus who had cleansed that same space, not with a sword but with zeal. The stairs were crowded. Pilgrims came and went. Priests walked with clean garments but heavy expressions. Nothing seemed to have changed. The system was still intact. The walls still shouted holiness, but inside something was missing. Zacchaeus climbed the steps with effort. He stopped before entering, looked up between the columns, took a deeper breath, and then crossed the portico. The courtyard opened before him like a living memory. The scent of incense, the distant chants, the murmur of prayers. He walked to a quiet corner, knelt, pressed his forehead to the cold stones, and there, not caring who might see him, he prayed, "Lord, I am no longer worthy to enter here as a Levite, nor as a righteous man, but I enter as one who was called by name." The tears came, not from pain, but from gratitude. He remembered his father who had always dreamed of seeing him serve in the temple, and who died believing his son was lost. Zacchaeus wept for not being the man his father had expected, but also for having become someone even better, a man reached by grace. He stayed there for a long time. When he arose, his body felt lighter. He looked around. Many walked by in haste, concerned with rituals, with rules, with appearances. But he knew the true temple had come to him long ago under the shadow of a sycamore, and later on a cross outside the city walls. Before leaving, he approached the great gate and touched the wood with reverence, whispered the psalm he had so often heard from his father, "For a day in your courts is better than 1,000, and concluded, "I would rather stand at the threshold of the house of my God than dwell in the tents of wickedness." As he descended the steps, he paused one last time, looked back. Jerusalem was still full, noisy, holy on the outside, confused within, but in his soul there was peace. He returned to Jericho without fanfare, without promises, only with the certainty that it wasn't the city that needed to change. It was the man, and that man had already been completely transformed. The room was small, lit only by the slanting light of late afternoon. A low table, worn scrolls, a bowl with fresh water. Zacchaeus dipped the quill carefully, his hands trembling but resolute. For weeks he had felt the quiet impulse to write, not out of vanity, nor to defend himself, but for something deeper, memory. Time has a way of erasing names, distorting facts, inflating stories, and he knew the name of Jesus had to be written with truth, not as legend, but as a living memory. And he, Zacchaeus, could not let his story and the calling he had received die with him. He took a deep breath, touched the parchment, and wrote, "I was called out of shame. I was up in a tree hidden from the crowd, and he saw me. Before I could ask, he called me by name, and entered my house and made me come down from myself." The words flowed like dew. There was no rush. Each line was written with reverence, like someone whispering before something sacred. He told of his Levitical childhood, the break with the temple, the plunge into corruption. He recounted how the people's eyes had become mirrors of his own decay. And then the day of the sycamore, the calling, the restitution, the cross. He described in detail the look in Jesus' eyes, the phrases that still echoed to this day, the hands that didn't push him away, but lifted him from within. He wrote with tears, not as one who reels pain, but as one who testifies, with love. Each night by lamplight, another page took form. He used no unnecessary names. He didn't exaggerate, he didn't embellish. He simply told with humility, with truth. Some neighbors began to whisper, "Old Zacchaeus is writing a scroll. He's leaving behind words, not wealth," and he smiled because that was exactly it. One afternoon Bartimaeus came to visit. He sat beside him, reading the freshly written passages. When he finished, he said, "This is not just for us, it's for those to come who never saw him, but will believe because of these words." Zacchaeus nodded slowly. He knew that many were already beginning to gather writings as mentioned by disciples from other regions. Eusebius of Caesarea would later record that several humble followers had left local accounts not as apostles but as men who had been touched, and that's what he was, touched, marked, remembered by heaven. He finished the scroll with a simple sentence. "He who saw me through leaves and shame now reigns, and I, who was unworthy even to stand among men, am now counted among those who have seen the light." He stored the scrolls carefully, asked that they be entrusted to someone who could care for words. He did not fear being forgotten, only that the name of Jesus be silenced. On one of the last pages, he wrote, "I do not seek to be remembered, only that he is never forgotten. For if a tree was the stage for my new beginning, may this testimony be shade for those still searching to climb." And with that he finished, not his life, but his mission. "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness." 2 Timothy 4:7-8. The dawn spilled slowly over the hills of Jericho, the sky tinged with gold, palm trees swaying gently, and the song of the first birds awakening the valley with reverence. It was a new day, but for Zacchaeus it would be the last. Seated at the doorway of his home wrapped in a simple cloak, he gazed at the horizon, his body hunched, thin hands resting on his knees, his gaze calm. The years had taken his strength, but left something even more precious, peace. He had lived much, not in possessions, but in depth of soul. He no longer counted days, he counted testimonies. Looking back, he saw a life that for a long time was darkness, but now at the end was light for others. To walk by, he breathed slowly. Each breath seemed to gather memories. The trunk of the sycamore, the table where he shared bread with the Master, the faces of the forgiven, the steps through dusty and grace-filled streets. Each scene was a seal upon his soul, a marker of a journey that didn't begin in a palace, but on a branch of shame. Someone approached. It was Bartimaeus, older, his beard graying, his eyes still alive. He sat beside him, in silence. They stayed like that for a while, simply watching the sky brighten. "Do you remember the first time you saw him?" Zacchaeus asked, voice faint. "I do. I remember that he saw me first. It was the same for me." They smiled with knowing warmth. Two men who shouldn't have been counted among the disciples, but were not by merit, but by mercy. Zacchaeus closed his eyes. The sun touched his face. He felt as he had when Jesus looked at him from under the tree. Seen, loved, called. "I have fought the good fight," he whispered. "I have finished the race and kept the faith." Bartimaeus took his hand, held it firmly. "The crown is already prepared, brother. Go in peace." Zacchaeus did not answer. A final smile formed on his lips. His face relaxed. His chest grew still, and he departed. Without sound, without struggle, he simply passed on, like someone stepping through a door, not to the end, but to fulfillment. Bartimaeus stayed there for a long while, then rose, wiped his eyes, and entered the house. On the table he found the scroll with the handwritten testimony. Beside it, a piece of aged wood carved discreetly with the word "seen." He stepped out and informed the others. They came in silence. They didn't weep as those who lose, but as those who return something precious to heaven. Zacchaeus, the tax collector, the traitor, the feared, was now remembered as a servant, a peacemaker, a brother. And his story, once condemned to vanish under dust and guilt, was now light for others because he had come down from a tree to rise with faith. And if you want to keep diving into these hidden and transformative stories of Scripture, click now on the videos appearing on the screen. Each one holds revelations that can change your view of faith. Thank you so much for walking with us this far. May this story have spoken to your heart. We'll see you on the next journey. Until then,